I wanted to revisit this topic of what Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau said, and I'm not sure how much of that clip that you watched.
I watched the whole thing.
Right. So basically, Dennis's point was that if somebody is using, well, he began by saying that he cares about the interior much less than the rest of you do, he said.
I am less interested in the interior person, morally speaking, than you are. And probably any of you are, and it's largely, I do believe, because I come from a behaviorist, law-based religion.
Look, I run a talk show like this. I can't tell you how many times I wish I phrased things differently or even changed my mind, and now that thing lives in infamy. So I really want to give Dennis the opportunity to perhaps rephrase, to rethink, okay? Because he's said a lot of things that I agree with. I respect him a great deal. But I think beginning with that point that he cares a lot less about the interior, and I thought, well, thank God that for Christianity, thank God for Jesus, who wants our hearts to be in line with the truth, not just our actions. If I have a child who has all these evil thoughts about, say, racist evil thoughts or thoughts about harming other people, I'm not satisfied if he just doesn't act on them.
Right.
I want the good to become easy for him. I want him to love the good, not just obey the good out of some sort of obligation. But he then said, in regards to pornography, and I do think he was kind of put on the spot here.
Right.
And I'm not sure what kind of editing went on. Unintentionally perhaps. But he said that if a man uses pornography as a substitute for marital relations with his wife, this is awful. He said, if a man uses pornography as a substitute for adultery, it's not awful.
If pornography is a substitute for one's wife, it's awful. If it's a substitute for adultery, it's not awful.
Well, I think both are awful, and I know you've spoken a lot about pornography. I have too. What are your thoughts on that?
So the most charitable interpretation of what Dennis Prager said, I thought, is that he simply doesn't understand what pornography is in 2023. So he talks about, like looking at pictures
the man
and
looking at a photo.
imagining. Yeah, which like when my dad sat me down when I was 13 and warned me against looking at porn, that's what he was warning me about. Don't look at these magazines. Like I see, old Playboys and Hustlers now in antique bookstores being sold as sort of like novelty items because we've moved so far past that era. Whereas I wonder what Dennis Prager would do, again, because like I've listened to a lot of his stuff, and so I want to treat him as an ally who's gone astray as opposed to somebody that I shred. But I wonder what he would say if he'd read that essay in The Atlantic last year, where 24% of American women between the ages of 18 and 34 reported being choked during intimacy as a result of porn, or the report from one of the UK education ministers saying that kids as young as 12 were being choked during sexual play. So one, kids that young were engaging in sexual play, and then two, they were actually engaging in these kinds of behaviors, and that this is now rapidly becoming the norm, that fundamentally what pornography has done is it's reshaped our minds, and as such, it's mainstreamed the idea of sexual violence in the romantic context, which of course you know better than anybody because you've spoken on this all over the place. When I speak on porn, one of the things I want to emphasize is that it's not just spiritually corrosive, which it is, but it's also going to make your mind like physiologically unsuited for what will actually bring you happiness, a real marriage, a real relationship. And that because of like, I see pornography the same way I see TikTok or other social media platforms. It's a persuasion technology because it reshapes the way that we think. It actually, like transforms our mind to be aroused and attracted to things that our conscience and our reason may tell us are reprehensible and vile. But at the same time, our body is screaming for them because we've trained our brains to be attracted to these things. And the moment for me that the violence that was becoming prevalent in pornography broke through the mainstream in Canada was we have this famous, for Canada, host on the CBC, which would be our state broadcaster, state-funded broadcaster. And he got accused of sexual assault by 13 or 14 women. And he came out with a statement where he accepted that he'd done all those things. Yeah, he had choked, he had hit, he'd done all this kind of stuff. And he said, I had a 50 Shades of Grey relationship. Basically, it was consensual, which is when a guy says that kind of thing is consensual, he's basically saying, yeah, I did, but she was asking for it. And then what shocked me, though, was not that he'd said this, because we're kind of used to celebrities doing that sort of thing these days, especially post-Me Too. But there was an article in the Toronto Star, which is Canada's largest and most left-wing newspaper, which said Jian Ghomeshi has been accused of unwanted sexual violence. like unwanted sexual violence, inherently affirming this idea that sexual violence is now permissible.
Yes.
And so what I do when I give talks on porn is I get the teenagers to submit written questions to me, so they actually will, ask what they want to ask.
Yep.
And I don't know what your experience is like, but the number of questions I get from like 13, 14, 15-year-old girls who are like, my boyfriend is asking me to do this.
Yes.
My boyfriend is asking me to do that. A lot of it's unnatural, it's violent, it's degrading, it's horrifying stuff. And these are young kids. And this is all learned behavior. So I feel like the people who were addicted to porn even 15 years ago were usually introduced to it as teens. Now, most kids are introduced to it 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. And so their brains actually never get the opportunity to be shaped by any real, wholesome, healthy view of sexuality. And what we're having is a generation of young men grow up with fundamentally deformed brains who see sexuality as something that is fundamentally cannibalistic and inherently violent.
Yeah. And if people want more proof of this, not to be too self-promotional, but you should get my book, The Porn Myth. It's a non-religious response to pro-porn arguments. I don't make a cent from the sales of the book. 100% of the royalties go to help sex traffic victims in San Diego. But when I gave that book to Trent, he read the section I had on what former porn performers were saying about their experience. He said he almost threw up. Yep. It was that bad. And these women certainly got left out of the discussion on this Exodus show. Again, I'm not picking on them. This is a big topic, and they weren't planning perhaps on having a whole discussion on pornography.
Charitably speaking, I just don't think he knew the stuff that we're talking about right now.
And to be clear, if all pornography was one single photo of one single woman, it would still be, in my estimation, an evil thing because it perverts the conjugal act. And so Dennis gave a sympathetic or a what would you say, a heart-moving story of a man who was looking after his bedridden wife like a saint. And wouldn't it be okay for him to then look at...
So this man was faithful to a wife with whom he could not have relations, obviously, for a decade or more. I think it went to 15 years. Would he have been wrong in relieving his sexual tension with a photograph?
No, it wouldn't be okay. Yes, it would be. It would be wrong. It's important, I think, to point out a couple of things. Just because something is less bad than something else, it doesn't make that thing good. If I smoke a packet of cigarettes a day, smoking my cigar here, instead of a carton, that's less bad, but it doesn't make it healthy. Feel free to jump in there.
No, I just think that one of the things he was doing was he's so articulate about why leftist arguments are so often finding a loophole and then, driving a whole culture through it. And then what does he do? He picks an extreme example that tugs at the heartstrings and then says, why would it be wrong for him? This is the way that the suicide activists brought in assisted suicide. It's why nobody talks about abortion, about bringing up a 12-year-old victim of sexual assault. They bring up examples that genuinely appeal to our empathy, but I think it exploits our empathy and our compassion in order to bring in an evil that will fundamentally destroy many people.
And society.
Yes.
That's right. Another thing I think he seemed to misunderstand, or at least it wasn't, and this is what I'd like to do if he does come on the show next month to talk about this, is there is a distinction that needs to be made between sexual desire and lust. In Thomas Aquinas' commentary in Matthew's Gospel, where our Lord says, if you look upon a woman with lust, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart, he makes a distinction between what he calls a pro-passion and a passion. He says a pro-passion is when we feel sexual arousal, but merely in a sensual way in which the intellect is not yet engaged. And then he distinguishes that from a passion in which we are now engaging the reason. That distinction has to be made. If you don't realize that there's a difference between feeling sexual arousal and then, say, fantasizing about what you could do to this woman sexually, if there's no distinction there, then obviously it seems insane to condemn lust because lust is outside of your control. And maybe this is why a lot of people think it's impossible to be pure because they think lust is the same thing as sexual desire, but it's not.
But did you get the sense from watching that clip, because I certainly did, that he'd never really thought about the issue particularly deeply? Because all of his responses were very pragmatic, like this is the way the world is. He said at one point, men like diversity. And it just didn't seem like a very well thought out position. It seemed like just a response to reality.
I would agree with you if he hadn't have begun with, I've been saying this for years.
Still, I think he hasn't been thinking about it for years.
Well, maybe that's true. And maybe he will now that he's getting pushback, and that would be great. I do think it was unfortunate the Daily Wire clipped that, because that was not a flattering clip, to say the least.
Yeah, they were probably attempting to be provocative, because it certainly would have triggered a lot of
definitely did that.
discussion, because like Ben Shapiro wrote a book called The Porn Generation.
Yeah, but was that about pornography? Or was that more about... Peripherally,
yeah. And Walsh and Knowles talk about pornography quite a bit.
And I don't think we're going to see them comment on this.
I doubt it. Because PragerU, don't they have a deal with the Daily Wire?
Like it wasn't on PragerU, it was on Daily Wire.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's the thing. So it's like... It would be nice. It would be nice to see that, because one thing I do respect about Daily Wire is they do allow a healthy disagreement between commentators, and they definitely have different views.
Yes, very much so.
So it would be nice to see that. Mm-hmm. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Would you like this beautiful, very high quality, definitely not made in China, not that there's anything wrong with that, Pints with Aquinas beer stein for free, sent to your door? Would you also like a copy of The Jill sent to your door 4 times a year? This is the Pints with Aquinas newspaper, by the way. If you do, go to mattfradd.locals.com and become an annual supporter for any amount. We'll send you that stuff for free, and you get a bunch of other free things in return. You'll get more information by going over to mattfradd.locals.com. Thanks.